Okay, well, thanks everyone for tuning in here on our second panel of the day. If you're just coming over from the conversation I had with John Cheminsky, welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time, I appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to join us and get involved in this conversation that we've got. As a starter here, I will remind the audience that there is a facility here on your screen to ask the question. Throughout the course of the conversation, we're going to take about the last 10 minutes of this panel to get to the different questions, or a couple of different questions that we have. We have a big audience and we probably won't get to everything, but we'll try to get to a few different pertinent questions from you all. So please put those in or submit those as they come to you. If you want to direct them to a member of the panel, go ahead and give me a name so that we can direct them to the right place. I'm joined today with four people who've had a lot to say as it relates to drug pricing. We have Stephen Ubel, the CEO of Pharma, Ellen Siegel, the head of Friends of Cancer Research, Peter Bach, director of the Center for Health Policy and Outcomes at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and Peter Kolchinsky, the managing partner at RA Capital, or a managing partner at RA Capital. And I want to start this by taking a look, maybe a little bit of context here is important, because this is not your usual drug pricing conversation. We are at the beginning, the tumultuous beginning of a new administration in just a few days. I think that it's really quite clear that you've got the Democratic majority that's going to be in place for the Senate, as well as the House and in the White House, which could substantially change the dynamics of a conversation that has centered very closely under the Trump administration as it relates to reimportation from Canada and a most favored nation type of approach towards drug pricing as well. All very controversial and much discussed. And I think we're going to probably see some changes as it relates to that. A part of this context relates to the fact that this is a discussion that has been going on now for several years. You've got a clear situation where large percentages of patients are clearly feeling the financial toxicity associated with new drugs, a lot of drugs. We just had a JAMA study come out a few weeks ago where they had 536 older patients with cancer and 18% suffering from depression, anxiety, and distress as it relates to the out-of-pocket costs that they have with cancer drugs. Earlier, Emory University did a study with multiple sclerosis patients, found 34% not compliant with meds because of out-of-pocket expense in a survey of 243. So, Peter, I mean, we've had this conversation as well. I do sometimes wonder about how long we'll be debating this particular point until something actually happens. So do you think that 2021 is going to be different?
Oh, John, it's really hard to project how this will all play out. But let's be clear that this is a equilibrium which is pretty destructive, but you can't fix it by only focusing on one part of it. We have a dynamic. We've decided that essentially prices of protected drugs that have monopolies should be set by the marketplace. And then we have a marketplace that tries to counter pricing by reducing spending on drugs through several mechanisms, one of which is negotiate for discounts or rebates as a form of leverage. Another is blocking or hindering access by having, formularies, prior authorization, and high out-of-pocket costs. And through the common and cost shifting for the people who do use drugs, having more of it come out of their pocket and less from insurance. And the challenge is, as long as we don't reckon with pricing from the monopoly side of it, we are left with some sort of system that harms patients because those are the sort of full set of tools the other side, the insurers, the PBMs, have to use to try and counter spending on drugs. And so the question is, is 2021, or is this new era, this moment where we get to this kind of uncomfortable bargain, which makes nobody happy, but at least puts patients in the center of it, have more rational pricing, have better coverage, kind of first dollar or very close to first dollar coverage for drugs that are needed, have the end of monopoly actually be the end of monopoly, not the beginning of court fights? And, can we get to that kind of balance, which I think would be net positive for everyone, although each person in their corner sees better positives in the current system.
So Ellen, from your perspective on patients, I mean, how sustainable is the current system? And do you expect any near-term changes that are going to come about as a result of the debate that's been going on?
Yeah, I think the current system is not sustainable. The pricing is high, the out-of-pocket and the stress and the financial toxicity are real. These are not imagined. However, I think the issue is what are the solutions and how do we get there so we continue innovation and affordable pricing and stop the out-of-pocket toxicity. And I am a strong believer we can get there. There are solutions to it. It isn't a one size fits all. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but what patients want are drugs that work, that are affordable. They want innovation and they want access, but they cannot afford this out of pocket. So this has to stop. The complexity is how do you stop and what are the short-term solutions? What are the long-term solutions? And I hope we'll get to talk about that, but there's no question there is stress on patients and the system and a great need for innovation. But I truly believe that you can get there with affordable pricing and you don't have to stop the innovation.
So Stephen, I think that it's fair to say that pharma had problems with the Trump administration's approach to this, particularly in the last year of the administration. Reimportation was a big issue. Most favored nation was a big issue. All those sorts of things that were considered not, kind of non-starters as it relates to where the industry is coming from. So do you think we're done with those debates, or do you think that we're likely to see a continuation of those as we try to find some sort of common ground?
Well, John, it's nice to be with you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
I'd like to say, I hope we're done with those conversations. It remains to be seen. But let me just say at the outset that I agree with much of what Peter and Ellen have already said. I mean, the industry is not for the status quo. We think the system needs to change in important ways. We acknowledge that too often patients struggle to afford their medicines. And it really is about the solution set. And we're ready to work across party lines to advance policies that really would solve the problem, would really lower what patients pay out of pocket for their medicines. And I'm pleased that a lot of the reforms that we've been talking about have generated bipartisan support. And when you have razor thin majorities in both bodies, it tends to favor incrementalism, policies that have bipartisan support. So things like capping out-of-pocket costs in Medicare Part D, lowering cost sharing, spreading consumers' costs across a calendar year so that they have more predictability in their month-to-month exposure, sharing rebates and discounts with patients at the pharmacy counter. These are ideas that candidly did not have broad bipartisan support even a couple of years ago, that now there's a consensus. If you look at whether it's HR 3, HR 19, the Crapo bill, the Grassley Wyden bill, you'll see that many of these reforms are included in all of those bills. And I would suggest that that's really where people should look for what's doable in the current environment. What are those reforms that enjoy broad bipartisan support?
Well, you spend a lot of time talking to lawmakers, and I think everybody on the panel would agree that you're quite influential in that respect. So I'm curious, when you talk to lawmakers about this, where do you find the low-hanging fruit, if there is such a thing in the drug pricing debate, where you're most likely to find that there's going to be, personally, I think that the last week has been so tumultuous that both parties will feel that there's a need to work on a more rational basis. And if that's the setting for what's coming up, it would seem to indicate that there is a real possibility that you can get some short-term changes out of Congress as it relates to drug pricing. So when you talk to lawmakers, where do you think that they're more likely on both sides of the aisle to find some sort of consensus, some sort of common ground?
Yeah, when I talk to members, what members are echoing is what they're hearing from their voters. And what voters say resoundingly, coming out of this election is they want three things. They want the pandemic to come to an end. And I think the industry has done really remarkable work in that regard with other stakeholders. Two, they want the economy to come back, which is related, of course, to the pandemic. And third, they want health insurance coverage that's affordable, that's effective, that's there when they need it. They don't want surprise bills. They don't want high out-of-pocket costs, no matter what the service being rendered is. And again, I think there is an opening in this electoral climate to work on those pragmatic reforms, because, you know, even if you look at the Senate, I would say that on the one hand, everything has changed. On the other hand, nothing has changed. You have a new Senate Majority Leader who has the ability to set the agenda, particularly on the Senate floor. You have new chairmen and chairwomen of the committees of jurisdiction. Those gavels are important. But at the end of the day, it's still extraordinarily hard to legislate on controversial items with margins this thin. You have a 60-vote threshold. Yes, you can use budget reconciliation. It's a very unwieldy tool to make lasting change. Many changes through reconciliation are subsequently reversed. So I share your optimism, and again, want to assure your viewers that industry is ready to, you know, we sat down with the previous administration and put forward proposals that, by the way, offered a lot of industry skin in the game to try to solve some of these problems. We understand that if you're going to cap out-of-pocket costs, for example, there's a cost associated with that industry is willing to help defray. So we're ready, willing, and able to get to work.
Peter, I'd like to get your perspective, because I think that it's a very valuable type of opportunity to talk to somebody that's in the industry, who's directly engaged in funding new drug development, about what the industry will want as well as what it will permit. I think that there are a variety of different powers that the industry have as it relates to drug pricing, not just in setting drug pricing, but also thwarting any sort of changes that may not be acceptable. The most obvious being reimportation from Canada, which is a subject that I always thought was never going to happen, simply because the pharma industry was in a position to prevent it from happening, and therefore wouldn't go ahead. So what's your own perspective on this? I mean, in terms of some of the different changes, one of the different changes that's been suggested in the run-up to this election was capping the annual increase in drug pricing. Is this something that the drug industry is going to permit?
So I'm coming at this problem from the perspective of somebody who spent my career making sense of how do we interpret all of the signals of what society values today into a prediction of what it's going to value in the future, so that we can put time and money at risk pursuing those products for the future. The patient, you know, has been always central to the analysis to figure out what's their, you know, significant unmet need that the entire system will fight to try to address and help them access the medicines they need, because it would be unconscionable not to. And I think it's critical that we figure out how we can bring about, you know, really the first case of insurance actually functioning in America. I don't know that it's ever really quite functioned, but we got to get insurance to actually work, which means we got to do away with some of these euphemisms, cost sharing. You know, that's just non-insurance, right? So I think that it is a lot more straightforward to envision a world where insurance does what it says it'll do, that after years of paying premiums, when you get sick and your doctor tells you need a medicine, you can get it, right? Now, once we have that kind of insurance, then we can ask, all right, well, is America as a whole being, you know, getting value for what it's paying? And I think it's really clear from an innovator's standpoint, those of us that are funding these drugs before they've even hit the market. So you can think of it as being in years -1 or -10 of a NPV model, of a net present value model, that we, you know, are motivated to put money at risk because of the promise of returns in the first 10 to 15 years of that net present value model. We gotta know that there's going to be a reward that, you know, spans roughly that period of time, which since Hatch-Waxman we've been able to count on. And so if it turns out that in order to give patients proper insurance, what lawmakers are going to demand is that all drugs actually go generic when they're supposed to, that, you know, we do away with the patent gaming and all those kinds of things, then I think that's a really great give to offer America. You know, it's not like small molecule companies historically, you know, have been able to play a whole lot of games. It's been, you know, disproportionately a trick that's emerged, you know, thanks to the complexity of biologics. But all drugs can go generic, you know, after 10 to 15 years without harming the incentives that people like me have to invest in creating new ones. So I describe that as the biotech social contract. I've written about it. It's the essence of the proposal that the nonprofit that I'm supporting and many other innovators are supporting, called No Patient Left Behind. And so if some of these other ideas, like, well, what about, you know, capping the rate at which new drugs, you know, can have their prices increased, also win out-of-pocket cost reforms for patients? I consider those to be, you know, debatable. We can maybe include them. It probably wouldn't be terribly toxic to innovation, except at the margin. And we've written about some of those cases, you know, where you launch a drug, you're not quite sure how many patients there are. If you know you got to get the price right on day one, and you'll never be able to raise it if it turns out that the market, you know, the number of patients is smaller than you thought, well, you're probably going to launch at a higher starting price. So there are unintended consequences of the kinds of things that were baked into Grassley-Wyden, but they can be tweaked, you know, and I've spoken with a person in Grassley's office, you know, who, you know, seemed to indicate like, all right, well, let's just say as we go through it, we revise this a bit and deal with those edge cases. We can certainly live with price increase caps if we had to. I just think that it's sort of non-core to, you know, the thing that makes drugs so valuable, so cost effective to America, the fact that they go generic, right? So I think the focus will end up being there, because when you think about the kinds of things that Americans really found galling, the idea that an old drug like Daraprim could turn out to be expensive again, or that Humira and insulins are as old as they are, and I don't mean 100 years old, I mean like 20 years old, and they're still expensive. And I think that the fixes for things like that are actually not yet written into bills.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a
Ellen.
question of Peter? So you're suggesting we pay whatever the market will bear and patients won't suffer because insurance will pick it up. But what about the idea of value and paying for value, and not incremental improvement, but real value, and valuing that? How do we deal with that? Because we need competition, we need innovation, we need a pipeline, but we also need to understand where there is value and to pay for value and to understand what that means.
I think it's a great question, but it's one that if you sort of study other aspects of our economy, you know, people do cost effectiveness math all the time. When they decide whether to pay for Netflix or not, that's cost effectiveness math. When you decide what to buy in a restaurant menu, that's cost effectiveness math. Where you live, all those things are, you know, cost effectiveness equations that we're all running all the time. And insurance companies fundamentally can simply say, if they want, that they don't want to cover a drug, and their premiums would, you know, they would argue be lower if they just didn't cover it. And you see some insurance plans playing around with things like that, except the American people speak and they say, no, that's heartless. I don't want to sign up for an insurance plan that doesn't cover medicines that I might actually need. And so insurance companies choose to pay for these products because those are the insurance plans that sell. So employers, they could say, I'd like to offer my employees insurance, but it's going to be really skimpy insurance. But they choose not to, because they're not going to be able to retain employees against another company that is offering better coverage. That's the marketplace functioning. People seem to believe that just because insurance companies are loath to not cover a gene therapy like Zolgensma, that somehow the market's not functioning. It's exactly functioning. It's the fact that it would be heartless to deny children access to a life-saving medication like Zolgensma that drives us to look for more such medicines. The FDA determines what is clinically meaningful, together with physicians, together with patients. That is the increment of improvement that we strive for. And we know that when our products fail to meet that increment of improvement, the FDA will turn it down. What we count on is that with the FDA having blessed a drug as offering, that step up in improvement, that America will make that available to people. Our industry is only branded drugs are only about 1.2% of GDP. For all of us to be sitting here discussing like that's the straw that's breaking the camel's back when our products are the only ones that go generic, hospitals don't go generic, nothing else about healthcare goes generic.
Okay.
It's
Hold
a
on.
broken question, I fear.
Let's get in Peter here.
Can I, Peter? Yeah, so
That's all right.
a couple of things, right? So I think we have to be cautious invoking the sort of market insight, or that the market is functioning here. The pharmaceutical marketplace is specifically designed to not have traditional market elements. The monopolies are essentially entirely artificial. They're granted by Congress. Peter says that
Every
insurers.
protected technology is an artificial monopoly.
Wait, let me talk, please.
All right.
But it's also not the case that insurers can turn down coverage of drugs, as you know. There's Medicare Part D has multiple protected classes. The entire country's Medicaid program has requirements to cover every FDA-approved drugs. There's a waiver now, maybe kicking around, I think in Tennessee, that will change that, but there aren't any established ones, and it comes with block grants. But there's other requirements for commercial insurers in most states covering most of the population to cover drugs for dread disease.
But that's the will of the people, Peter. We voted for policies to create these protected classes. Why do we pretend that that's not the market?
Okay, so all right. So then the market comes along and introduces co-insurance or co-pays or cost sharing. I know the words I guess you didn't like, but you essentially go to consumers and say, well, look, you don't have to pay the full price of drugs, but I think we can all agree you have to pay a hell of a lot for them in some cases. You've told me that I buy my Netflix subscription because I think it's cost effective, right? And there's lots of surplus in there given how much I use it. But you're telling me that we shouldn't stick patients with a portion of the cost of the drug, even though you're saying it provides them with tremendous value. So it's not that I don't think that's a great idea either, because a share of an enormous price puts access out of reach. And I don't think the purpose of a healthcare system.
I think the word value there is being misused, Peter.
I'm sorry?
Being misused. I think the word value is being misused by a lot of people in this debate.
No, but I'm just simply saying all I'm saying is that putting some portion of the price of a drug onto a consumer is the best possible example of them being able to then make their cost effective.
At the end of the day, we do. We are all consumers. It's just the whole notion of insurance is that we pay for those drugs while we're healthy and employed, precisely so that when we are sick and vulnerable, we can get it. That's the essence of insurance.
But I don't understand. If you think that I buy Netflix because it's a good deal, why shouldn't you say, okay, you have to pay $2,000 for your $10,000 a month drug?
Well,
you must
Peter,
value it much more than that.
You pay town taxes. You pay town taxes. And therefore, when your house catches fire, the fire truck rolls up and puts it out, and they don't charge you a copay. There's lots of analogies in our system that show how insurance works. You're right. Netflix doesn't really require insurance. So,
John, do you mind if I jump in?
Peter, let's get Stephen in here.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we need to strive for some balance here. You have a situation today where 3 PBMs control 80 or 90% of the market. Health plans have dramatically consolidated. Hospitals have dramatically consolidated. All these actors use their leverage very effectively. They can pit one medicine against another. They can non-cover a medicine, and they do. As a result, drug spending and drug prices are growing under the rate of inflation. I think retail medicine prices dropped in 2019 by something like 0.4%. The problem is consumers are not, feeling the fruits of the competitive marketplace because of the reasons that both Peters are talking about. And so out-of-pocket costs have actually exploded over the same period of time where drug spending and prices have rapidly decelerated. If you're a consumer with a brand medicine deductible, your out-of-pocket costs have grown by more than 50% since 2014. So in this tectonic battle between plans and manufacturers, guess what? Plans are winning. Plans are winning, and the bubble on the other end that Peter Bach is talking about is out-of-pocket costs growing beyond where they should for patients to adhere to their medicine and lower downstream healthcare costs. So we need to let competition work. You know, I would say to Peter Kalinsky, look, if there are outlier practices on patents, let's talk about them. And I would say to Peter Bach, if there are other distortions in the system, the reason the protected classes, by the way, got set up is because insurers were discriminating against a lot of those patients in terms of creating their formularies.
Can I just add a little bit on
reaction?
Okay, let's get Ellen here. Get
No,
Ellen
I mean,
here.
I think you're talking around the consumer and the patient. They have to have access, they have to have affordability, and they have to have innovation. But not everything out there is worthy of the cost. And we do have to have some value equations and define what that means. And we have to look at systemic change. I mean, checkpoint inhibitors, 11 on the market, maybe 2,000, 3,000 trials. Is that what we want? Is that what we're calling a competition? That's not what we need to do. We have to make systemic changes to really look at our clinical trial infrastructure, how we pay for value, and what patients value.
Why
And
wouldn't
this
you want more branded drugs in a class, though? That's like them going pseudo-generic.
Yeah, well, but the point is that it's an issue. Why do we have these combinations? No one does not want competition.
But people say we have monopolies. They rage against drugs having monopolies. You just mentioned 11 checkpoint inhibitors.
Yes.
One inhibitors are played against one another. That's not a monopoly.
But they're not, Peter.
No,
I mean,
but there are 2,000 or 3,000 trials that are not accruing patients and getting answers.
Yeah,
So
but
no one is suggesting that that there's one in a class. One is suggesting do we need 11? Do we need 2,000, 3,000 trials that are going to ravage patients and not get the answers? I mean, we have to look at these things. They're really important questions.
Well, we all just saw COVID, attract hundreds of trials, hundreds of ideas, right? And a few of them work out. You can work out quickly and make a difference. So, do we really want to stifle the creativity of an entire industry by saying some central body will determine top down what is valuable and what's not?
No one is suggesting that. I don't believe anybody on this panel would suggest that.
I would make 2 points. I would make 2 points myself. One is that if you do have greater R&D efficiency, I don't think there's any suggestion that it's going to lead to lower prices. Because when you see very efficiently developed drugs, they don't necessarily come onto the market at a low price. They can come on at just as high, if not higher prices than you might otherwise expect.
That's because they're supporting a portfolio, John.
The other thing is,
pay for
with
themselves.
the multiplication of drugs in any particular class, you typically see 1 or 2 develop as the dominant therapies, and the rest of them just kind of go by the wayside in a lot of different respects. You don't see a big impact on pricing. On that score,
rebates. The rebates stem from a lot of competition between drugs in similar classes or in the same class. So,
Peter, let's get the other Peter Bach. Let's get your input on this one.
Yeah, no, well, first of all, just to circle back and be clear, I'm in Steve Ubel's camp here in the sense that we need to get to a balance where we don't put high out-of-pocket burdens on patients, but we need a more rational way of figuring out the revenue model for the industry. I also am in his camp in the sense that the consolidation of the PBM industry has been net negative. It probably isn't delivering the savings it could because PBMs have not figured out a way to internalize the savings in the current model. And I would love to see them broken up and actually compete on the services they provide. I was bringing up the issue about coinsurance and costs simply to point out that Peter Kolchinsky's argument that consumers are indicating the value of the products is sort of contradicted by any effort to reduce the coinsurance just from a pure market perspective. But there's little question that the net prices were, I want to get back to this Canada question. The net prices we're achieving in the US through the current model, and this gets to rebates and brand-to-brand competition and things like that, are not the lowest prices the industry would accept. And I think what's happened in Washington is that people look at prices paid in Canada or other OECD countries. And I think we probably all agree that the net prices are on average considerably lower than they are in the US in the commercial market or in the Medicare market. 30, 40% discounts at least in a lot of countries, adjusted for purchasing power or wealth. That they look at those things and they say, we want that. And so they are struggling to come up with a way of getting it. And so reimportation is a version, I don't want to say it's a shortcut, but it's an operationalization of an observation without consideration of the dynamic effects of it. And so, which doesn't surprise me. And same with this kind of most favored nation, whatever that is, averaging other countries' costs and then sticking reimbursement in an average of that, or 1.2 times the average or something. And so there's a disconnect between seeing this as a epiphenomenon of a problem that we could pay lower prices in the US, and at least for established products, we could get them, manufacturers would sell them to us, and how we get there, which is probably going to need to be, or I believe would need to be internal to the US market, because we are the 800-pound gorilla. We can't look at Ireland and say, oh, we're gonna, jump on top of Ireland's prices and think nothing will happen in Ireland. That just is extraordinarily illegal.
Yeah, indeed. So Stephen, I'm curious, let's kind of change the dynamic here in a certain respect, because there are some very interesting notions out there as it relates to how you might effectively start to bring in prices. One of those is to adopt at least the same kind of a program that you see in other countries, if not trying to leverage those prices, but try to leverage the kind of programs, the kind of policies that you have, say, in the UK, where you have NICE reviewing drugs, establishing values, negotiating what it is that the National Health Service will pay for. So when you see something like a debate related to something like, well, should we set up a US NICE? What's the response from pharma?
Yeah, well, look, I one of the great things about my job, at least before the pandemic, was that I traveled a lot to a lot of these countries. I met with a lot of heads of state. I met with a lot of health ministers. And I'm here to tell you, you can, fill in the blank, immunotherapies, CAR T, Amavig for migraine, you can go right down the list. Most of these countries do pay less and they get less. Patients just don't have access to the latest treatments and cures. It's roughly half the average access that we enjoy in the US. So I think we need an American solution to this problem, not simply importing other people's value judgments and bureaucracies. When it comes to value assessment, Ellen mentioned this, Peter did as well. We think there's a role for value assessment. I would say dollar for dollar, there's no other industry that puts more data on the table about the value of its products. I don't see near as much value assessment occurring on the healthcare services side, on the procedure side, et cetera. There's a lot of data that comes to bear when it comes to medicines. But value assessment methods have to be open and transparent. They have to be flexible. They have to take into consideration what's really important for patients. And until we get to a point, unfortunately, ICER, NICE, a lot of these entities simply don't meet those basic tests yet. And so,
they can't be political either. These equations must not be political. They must truly try to get to a truth. And they oftentimes don't. And you have a lot of discussion out there about you're doing cost effectiveness math of a drug, but you're ignoring the fact that in 10, 12 years, it's going to go generic, right? Why do you do that? You can ask that. I did once ask that of somebody at NICE, and he said, oh, because that would make the drug look more cost effective. And that's not my job. I'm trying to negotiate lower prices.
That's just the wrong answer. That's not how cost effectiveness works. You look at the individual subject getting the drug at that price. You don't do future spin outs of drug.
But Peter, you're talking about.
I'm just telling you how
I get how it's done, the justifications for it. It's adopted to figure out whether that hospital on that day for that patient should use a drug. But we're talking about using it for societal investment decisions. Is this innovation worth it? Is a societal question. It has nothing to do with the value of Bob's life. The kind of CE analysis that people have done historically and that you're talking about, for example, would talk us out of developing any kinds of drugs for smallpox pandemic preparedness. Why? Because every dollar you're spending is a dollar that you're dividing by 0 qualities. There's no one to treat. Therefore, it's an infinite expense. It breaks down. Antibiotic value cannot possibly be done with conventional CE, because the value of those antibiotics is not just for saving the lives of the few people who might need a novel antibiotic today. It's because we're all worried about the possibility of resistant bacteria, creeping up on us and killing a lot more people in the future. So cost effectiveness math itself right now is an underdeveloped field that is being misappropriated by some for political ends to try to obfuscate the issue and make it sound like drugs are not worth it. They're literally looking at the mortgage payments that America is making to take ownership of future generic drugs, which offer a tremendous amount of value, and basically saying, well, let's not look at it as a mortgage investment. Let's pretend that what you're paying for these drugs is an eternal rent. Well, as long as drugs go generic, that's just not true. It's a mortgage investment.
But
And
you're
you're
suggesting we can't have value and cost effectiveness and innovation, and that just is not correct.
No. Actually, when people have done, Ellen, what I'm saying is that when you do cost effectiveness math with the purpose of getting to truth, what you will discover from economists like Darius Lekwadala, Julian Reap, Peter Newman, and many others that are not at ICER at the moment, you will discover that they would say, well, actually, we're leaving an awful lot of value on the table that would show you, like Dana Goldman has pointed out, it would show you that society is capturing the vast majority of the economic surplus of drugs. In other words, society is getting a great deal from drugs, and you would have to use a very anemic math, the kind that ICER favors and that Germany and the UK use when they negotiate drug prices, in order to convince yourself of the opposite.
Okay, Peter, let's give Ellen the floor here for a second.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think we all agree that we have to pay for value and we want innovation. There is no disagreement. The issue is what value really means, what it means to a patient, what access means, and how you have systemic change. And nobody is talking at all about our clinical trials infrastructure and the inefficiency of these trials and what we're doing with all the companies and all the NIH trials and every institution doing their own trials on it. There's a lot, and what questions and how fast we get there and how efficiently we get there. There's no discussion at all about that infrastructure at all, which needs major changes. And there are companies that are doing some of these things. EQRX, Peter and I are involved in it. They're looking for value that is affordable. There are people that are looking at prevention, early detection, curative therapies. We have to look at those as well. We just can't put all of these drugs in the same class and say we pay for everything. We have to pay for value, we have to pay for access, and we have to understand what patients want. And particularly in science and where we're looking at precision medicine, this is a very complex equation with not one size fits all. But we have to look at the goals of getting the patient the best care possible without bankrupting them.
Okay, so I would like to introduce a new concept here that I'd like Stephen to pick up on, and then everybody else. One is that, as I said at the beginning, this is an area where we've had discussions rolling on for several years. And it seems like every year nothing happens and the discussion gets more and more extreme. I mean, you see the loopiest ideas come along that are highly damaging to the industry, and I don't think particularly productive in terms of trying to resolve this particular debate. So, Stephen, do you think that we're in a situation now where that patients are so frustrated, people are so frustrated, that there has to be some sort of traction this year? There has to be some sort of real world advance, however small, but something. Do you think something really will happen this year?
I hope so. As I said at the outset, we do think there are important changes that need to be made. I think you have to be pragmatic in the sense that the country has some much larger problems in front of it, starting with the pandemic, bringing the economy back, broader infrastructure issues. That the president's going to have his hands full in the first 100 days. But I'm hopeful again that this debate is ripe for progress, and the threshold and prism with which we're going to look through to this debate is: are we really solving the problem? We can acknowledge there's likely to be some pain involved from the industry and whatever Congress or the administration decides to pursue. But is that pain going to actually translate into lowering patients' out-of-pocket costs and improve the consumer experience in a meaningful way? I mean, if you look at MFN, or HR3 for that matter, you're going to take hundreds of billions of dollars in R&D out of the industry. You're going to wreck providers. You're going to put future innovation at risk. And for what? Most Part B patients have supplemental insurance. It's not going to help patients in a meaningful way. So again, we hope that the environment, even if it's not at the outset, is conducive for policy change. One of the other areas we haven't talked about is trying to address other distortions in the system. You look at the 340B program. We support the program, particularly as it was initially intended to really help those hospitals that were treating a disproportionate number of uninsured or underinsured individuals. You now have 50% of the hospitals in the country qualifying for the program. They get the best price, the Medicaid price, the best price in the marketplace. And then they turn around and mark up the price of the medicine by 500 to 1,000%. Now, we have to get our arms, or it's the same issue with the rebate system. Why should somebody who has type 1 diabetes go to the pharmacy and pay the full list price of insulin when their health plan is getting a 50 to 70% discount? In the 340B program, there's no guarantee that patients are going to see the benefit of the provider getting the Medicaid price. That's absurd. So we want to make sure that the solutions that Congress considers or the administration considers actually solve the problem. Or we're going to be back, they can take 100 billion, 200 billion, fill in the number out of the industry, and we won't have solved the problem.
Yeah, so I think we're 47 minutes in, and I don't think Steve has said one thing I disagree with, which really disappoints me.
Me too, Peter.
There's still time, because I also think 340B needs to be reformed, and we need point of sale rebates and all those other things. But I think one of the challenges nested in here, and it gets to Peter Kolchinsky's point, which was the more general, the larger point about the rewards for successful innovation and the risk taking that's involved, is there is an implicit trade here that I think we just have to look square in the eye. It's not the case that if we cut drug prices by 3%, all innovation will stop. And it's not the case if we double drug prices, all disease will be cured. There's a continuum. We need to understand it better. And what Steve, I don't want to get in the weeds here, but Steve just characterized HR3 as something that would really retard innovation. But if you take the scoring of that bill, kind of what CBO thought of it, it said, yeah, there would be a fewer drugs, but more importantly it gave a lot of credit to the widened use of drugs reducing healthcare costs, and that widened use coming from falling prices. And I don't remember the number, maybe you do, Steve, like 60 to 100 billion or something like that, say, in Medicare's Part A and B over 10 years, a real number. And so there's two trade-offs going on here. One is, as prices of drugs, the opportunity for high prices goes up or down, the investment in innovation, as Peter Kolchinsky has pointed out, also moves up or down. We don't understand that relationship well, but I think everyone acknowledges it. But the other side of that is, as out of pockets and the quality of coverage goes up and down, access goes up and down. And when medicines are effective, which most of them are, that utilization affects health today. So there's two different trade-offs. And I think none of us are happy with the latter trade-off. But the former one about the prices and the pace of innovation really does need to be understood and not looked at as a binary thing, because it leads to this no pricing constraint kind of mindset, which is for sure inefficient.
Peter, what if they revised their math and went back and said, wait, we made a mistake. Actually, if HR3 were to pass, it would cut the pace of innovation in half. 59 drugs were approved last year. John, you guys wrote up a great article on that. So 30 fewer drugs per year. Would you say, oh, wow, that's actually a big hit. That's too much?
I think, like I said, I think we need to triangulate on this number. And I think the answer is, what does a model tell me about how much health we've created in the next decade? Because if the answer is that a whole bunch of people get access to medications that can't afford them now, and that creates a lot of health, then it could be that within 10 years, net health or total health is more, even with such a big cut. And I'm not conceding that that big a cut would happen. But the other thing, and we've written about this extensively, where the drugs are most out of joint in terms of cost effectiveness is where the international price discrepancies, which would be used to anchor referencing, are also out of joint. So CAR T therapies see high prices overseas, just like they do in the US. It's other drugs, as Steve pointed out, there's plenty of drugs that Germany doesn't even adopt into its formulary because the regulators are unconvinced the drugs provide incremental value, let alone incremental value at the price. And most of the drugs that fall off the formulary are the ones that sort of fail the IQWiG model. So if it's across the board, just like randomly choosing development programs and killing half of them, that's going to be considerably more damaging than what will probably happen, which is marginal programs with drugs are unlikely to work, that the only business model is overcharging for them. If those are the things that get killed off, I'd say in 10 years, we might still end up ahead.
So you can't just kill off the less compelling programs. They're the byproduct of everybody trying as hard as they can, right? So the question is simply, when you get a drug that turns out not to be as awesome as you wanted it to be, but the FDA says, well, it's still better than standard of care, do you want it, right? Second of all, the CBO did make a math error, and the impact of cutting ballpark $80 billion a year off of the $160 billion a year that the industry collectively spends in R&D is that you'd lose half of the resources you put into R&D. But if you achieve that through a price control, and Peter, I agree with you, 3% off, what America spends on drugs, sure, no big deal. The question is, how did you achieve it? And if it's achieved by a committee after the fact, after you've invented a drug, saying, well, now we will run some math that has been designed to make your drug look less worth it than it is, and we will simply tell you what the price is. I can tell you that all investment in all kinds of projects will stop as of right now. I cannot invest in a preclinical drug knowing that we're on a trajectory where it's going to be seen as perfectly acceptable to have a government committee or whoever simply dictate the price of a drug.
And I would say with a patient, without patient input and patient values and things that are really important to patients as well.
Well, companies do take a lot of patient input into account. It's precisely the patient unmet need, how much patients want these drugs, that drives these decisions today. But for a committee in the future to just say, oh, patients, don't worry about it, we got you. You're going to get the drug you want, and we'll just say how little we have to pay for it. Well, sure, once a drug's been invented, it can't be uninvented. And so patients will get that drug. But investment in all hope, all improvement will cease. And that's a shame of it.
So Peter, I want to get to a couple of questions here from the audience before we wrap up. One of them goes directly to your proposal related to genericization. It's how will going generic improve access for cancer drugs? Oncology is an area of rapid innovation where standard of care is constantly updating. By the time a drug goes generic, there are already many newer, better drugs on the market. How do we address this issue through that program?
Standard of care keeps getting better because we are willing to pay for new drugs that are better than the old. And that doesn't mean that the old drugs are retired and are useless. It means that we're building on that foundation. So if we ever reached the end of innovation, that's it, we just can't think of ways to improve on it, then the cool thing about the entire drug industry, or almost the entire drug industry, is that it'll be generic within 15 years, and that's it. There'll be nothing to complain about. The costs will be low on the drug side. It'll be healthcare services that keep rising indefinitely, tied as they are to land and labor. But if we have, hope that we can actually do better, then, with medicines, that we can keep improving on standard of care, then it's only by telegraphing, it's only by society telegraphing to innovators and investors that if you come up with something better than we have now, you will be richly rewarded. That's the only way you're going to get them to take these tremendous risks over 10, 15 years of investment in order to make that progress. So I hope that we don't end up rescinding that signal that so far America has been sending quite clearly, because we're good at this. We're making progress. And I would urge everybody to read the article that you guys put out, John, you and your team put out, profiling the 59 drugs that were approved in 2020. Each one of them, many of them, they list how much better it is than standard of care. And if you take that view that Peter Bach just shared, don't just tell me about the drugs we approve in 1 year, show me what you can do in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. It's hard not to be inspired by the progress. When my daughter made that painting for me, she's 7. 50 years of progress at the pace that we have been making progress, you can't even imagine how much better healthcare is going to be. And 15 years beyond that, every one of those drugs will have gone generic, as long as we implement some fixes to current market failures.
Okay, well, Stephen, let's get Steve. I'd like to get Stephen's reaction on this part of the whole thing. It's something you touched on earlier. Obviously, when you get to a drug like Humira, this is the one thing that touches off a lot of sensitivity. It's an area where the manufacturer has done everything possible in order to maximize the amount of time it can remain as a huge franchise, spinning off billions of dollars a year. It tends to get a lot of people upset. And it's also the sort of program, a franchise approach that any manufacturer takes when there's that much money at stake. They're going to defend that franchise to the last attorney. Is there something practical that can be done as it relates to that where the industry is going to be willing to give it up? Because when you get right down to the company, they don't do it.
Yeah, John, I appreciate the question, and I hate to end in disagreement with both Peters on this point. I mean, with regard to Peter Bach's points about HR3, I tend to agree with Peter Kolchinsky that CBO really didn't get it right, and if you include the commercial market impacts and so forth, it would have a very significant negative impact on the future of innovation. And as a practical matter, as much as I like vision and dental benefits, I also have a problem with the fact that the savings are not channeled into first dollar coverage and the types of insurance reforms that you would like to see. On Peter's points, which vast majority I've agreed on, I would encourage some level of patience. If you think about the biosimilars market, for example, there are 18 biosimilars approved. There's 100 more in FDA's development program. I think the annualized savings, in 2020 or something like $6.5 billion with 100 billion in savings projected over the next 5 years. We're just a little further behind where Europe was at this stage of the game in terms of establishing the regulatory framework, but I think we're going to get there. To try to answer your question, specifically though, I do think the industry needs to do a better job of stepping back and looking at some of these practices that preclude competition. Our whole, if there's nothing your viewers take away from my remarks other than this, it's that competition is the right answer. I don't think Peter Bach has enough deference to the competitive marketplace in terms of its ability to control both price and spend. And some of the distortions in the marketplace that I talked about would clearly improve competition and lower price and costs. Obviously, if there are outlier practices related to patents, we should step back and address them. It's just very difficult to do. One person's frivolous improvement that shouldn't have been patented is another person's valuable incremental advancement. And it just becomes very difficult to sort through that.
So let's end up with Ellen here. I'd like a kind of a final remark from Ellen based on the conversation that we've had, Ellen. How confident are you that the average patient that's having trouble right now with financial toxicity is going to feel a significantly lower level of pain at the end of this year than they're feeling at the beginning of this year, based on our conversation today?
Yeah, I'm not confident that's going to happen so quickly. I am confident the system can do it and get there, but to think that we're going to end financial toxicity in 1 year and have a one-size-fits-all solution.
Just lessen it, not end it, just
Yeah.
lower it.
Yeah, I think as we have really discussed value and what innovation means, and we can get there. I don't think it's impossible. I think there is a lot of bad information out there. I know patients care deeply about access and about financial toxicity, but they also care about quality of life and curative therapies and innovation. There's no patient that is being treated for a disease now who doesn't want to feel better, wants to look forward to living longer and prevention and early detection. So I think the system has to change, and it will, but it's not going to happen overnight. And there isn't an easy fix that's going to work for all of it, but we can all agree, every single one of us agree that innovation is important and keeping the pipeline going is important. What we don't get to is how we're going to sustain it and how we're going to help patients and how it's going to be affordable. And I think there are ways to get there.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the hour out and having this conversation. Like I said, I think we're at the point of seeing something. I don't know exactly what, but I do think we're going to see something happen here over the near term that could have a significant effect. I'd like to think that that's possible. We are at a unique juncture in this country's history, and I think that that includes a look, kind of a new look at the way we handle drug pricing, hopefully without, from my own perspective, some of the silliness we've seen in the past. So with that, thanks to everybody. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
And we'll talk about it again. And thanks to the audience for turning out. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Thank you. Bye.